Ah, there you are. Welcome to one of SciFest's very successful seminars for 2022. And I must thank the organizers at SciFest for doing such a wonderful job, especially during lockdown. We are cut off from the real world and we want to know what's going on. And today we have a really exciting show for you. My name is Parthy Chetty. I'm the Executive Director of the ESCOM Expo for Young Scientists, and SciFest has been a longtime partner of the Expo. Today, we are focusing our presentation on languages in science. What role do they play? And it's something that many of us tend to shy away from. But today, we have a very brave researcher who's done some sterling work, and she's very anxious to share that with us. And I'll introduce her in a short while. But just some food for thought. In a recent poll a few years back, South Africa was ranked at number 144 internationally on a poll that was testing our learners' performance in maths and science. Now, that may come as a shock to many of us because we know maths and science, we have some fantastic learners, fantastic schools. How is that possible? One of the things that may explain why this phenomenon is we have 11 official languages in our country. So how relevant is it that many of our learners are not being taught in their mother tongue, especially in maths and science? There are specific terminology that will probably be available in English, but may not be in other languages. And I'm very keen to hear what our presenter, Dr. Carolina Ödman, is going to share with us. So just a brief introduction of a very, very exciting speech coming up. Dr. Ödman is an associate professor at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa, and associate director, development and outreach at the Inter-University Institute for Data-Intensive Astronomy. Wow, that sounds really exciting. She's trained in physics at the EPFL in Switzerland. She holds a PhD in cosmology from Cambridge University in the UK. She has done research in several fields of physics and developed educational programs based on science, from early childhood to postgraduate training. She has also worked in a financial technology startup. She now focuses on researching and bringing a development agenda to science. That's very exciting. Her work has earned her numerous awards, nationally and internationally. Most recently, she was awarded the NSTF South 32 Award, Communication Award, for her efforts in translating scientific content into African languages. Finally, something in common with Dr. Ödman, because we were also part of the South 32 awardees and winners not too long ago. Without much further ado, it is really my pleasure to invite Dr. Carolina Ödman to present to us her wonderful presentation on science and the languages. Dr. Ödman, over to you.
Wow, thank you so much for this impressive introduction. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to share this this work because, as you've mentioned, it's really, really important. So I'm going to just share my screen and put it in presentation mode. Okay, can you see the first slide?
Yes, okay. Yes, we can.
All right, thank you so much. So yes. What I'm going to tell you today is talking science in indigenous languages. And well, by looking at me and hearing where I come from, you might wonder, why would I be a person who can talk about indigenous language and science? Let me just tell you a little bit of my background. So you've heard my sort of professional background, but I was born in Switzerland of Swedish parents. So at home, we used to speak Swedish. But then I went to school in Switzerland, in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. So I did all my schooling, even my undergraduate up to master's studies in French. So I learned all my science in French. But then I was accepted for a PhD in the United Kingdom, and I landed in the UK, and suddenly everything was in English. And I really struggled to have to, translate mentally everything I'd learned in French into a whole new working language. But eventually I did it, but it was hard work. And eventually I got it. So I was working and I was thinking in English. I got my PhD and everything. Then I got a job in France. So I went to France for that job. And suddenly I realized that I had lost some of my French. Where I wanted to talk about scientific topics, it was the English words that came to my mind, because I had been completely immersed in English for the last 3 and a bit years doing my PhD. And I realized that, we would be talking informally about science in French and just borrow the English terms instead of using the terms that exist in French. So that was, again, confusing. Then I got a postdoc in Italy, and I realized that a lot of Italian scientists, professors and everything at Italian universities had the same problem, especially if they had been trained abroad. So now imagine this, a professor in Italy giving a talk about science to learners in Italy, and not remembering the Italian terms for scientific terms that exist in Italy. But English is so dominant that you sort of lose it if you work in English all the time. Then I got a job in the Netherlands, and I had to learn Dutch. And really, Dutch and English is very integrated. And it's like, there's no real need for language for science in the Netherlands, because everybody speaks English in the Netherlands really well. And so I could see that the Dutch scientists had a very easy time. So anyway, and now for the last nearly 12 years now, my life is in South Africa. So I've come from these multiple languages, and I've come to this country that has 11 national languages. And to put this into perspective, I've just got a couple of maps here. So the little blue shape there in the middle is Switzerland. That's where I was born, and I grew up, and I went to school. It's a small country that has 4 national languages. In 3 of those languages, we have schooling, teaching resources, teacher training, and universities in 3 of those 4 languages. It's completely embedded. These are the countries that I've lived and studied and worked in, and so on. And in each of these countries, same thing. You have schooling, you have teaching materials, you have teachers who speak, you have teacher training, and you have universities in the languages of each of these countries. And in fact, in every one of these countries on the map that you can see, there is the whole range of education all the way to professional activity in the mother tongue of that country. Now, if I put South Africa on top of Europe, you'll see that there's, it encompasses quite a lot of European countries in terms of size. And it demonstrates, okay, so the population density isn't the same, but it sort of shows like the variety and the diversity of languages that you can find in a geographical region that works well. It has good schools, good universities and everything, compared to South Africa. So now I'm switching it. I'm taking Switzerland. So this green shape here is the shape of Switzerland, and I've put it on top of South Africa. I've put it over Cape Town because Cape Town is where I am now, and it basically corresponds to where I grew up on the map in Switzerland as well. And the False Bay is the same size as the Geneva Lake and so on. So it works quite well. But can you see this little green shape? There's 4 national languages and schooling and teachers and resources and colleges and universities in 3 of those 4 languages. And we think we can achieve anything similar on the surface as big as South Africa with its incredible diversity of cultures, of languages and things. And I think it's a real challenge. So I'm fundamentally really interested in this question. And so let me look at the issues a little bit of language. So first, I'm just going to talk about English, not really Afrikaans. The issues with English is that, well, English dominates the market, the job market, right? So there's lots of really great career opportunities in maths and science and in technology, but English is the language of the industry. We have to recognize that, right? Then English is also the colonial language. So the current scientific edifice, the body of modern scientific knowledge was built in colonial languages, English, Dutch, lots of these European languages, but also with Western European modes of thinking. So for example, classification. So one example is that if you look at the incredible biodiversity that we have in South Africa, and you look at the names of plants, they have names like Whitsonia and this and that are named after, the colonial scientists who came and sort of cataloged them and classified them and so on in a taxonomy. And so that way of thinking is very much a Western European way of thinking. And then a third problem, which my host kindly referred to earlier, is that English is actually a foreign language to most learners. And I know it's an official language of South Africa. Why do I say it's a foreign language? So I want to look at these numbers from the South African census a little bit. If this is language dominance by different groups of people in South Africa, right? And we see that amongst the colored, white, Indian, and other is also foreigners and so on. But I think most important is amongst colored, white, and Indian people in South Africa, the fraction of English and Afrikaans first language speakers, so if English Afrikaans is the absolute first language, is nearly 100%, it's 90% plus, right? So 9 out of 10 kids out of those groups will speak as a first language, the language of instruction of science. But if we look at the Black population of South Africa, which is 79.2%, nearly 80%, 8 out of 10 people in South Africa, only 4.5% of them speak English or Afrikaans as a first language. So the vast majority of people in this country do not speak as a first language the language that is used to teach maths and science in the country. And I think this is a massive barrier to access. So if most learners must learn mathematics and science in their second or third language, surely the teachers have a similar challenge of having to teach something that's fairly abstract, can be very difficult to teach in their second or third language. So this really, for me, is like a very profound challenge that goes both ways. But there's also issues with science. So let me look at some issues with science, right? Science has a very strong colonial past. Modern science, the current scientific edifice was built on, amongst other things, an inhumane appropriation of indigenous knowledge. I'll give you an example of that. For example, when European colonizers discovered the source, for example, of a spice or of a natural plant that would become very big in Europe and have a lot market and lots of uses in Europe, what they would do is they would send armed people to come and enslave and really like kill a lot of people who knew where this plant came from, the people who knew the roots of the plants, what its meaning, its uses, and so on. And then they would enslave them and they would control the production, but their slaves who had all the indigenous knowledge would have to apply that knowledge for the Europeans to get the plants and put them and bring them to the European market. And so it's really an inhumane appropriation of indigenous knowledge. I don't know how else to describe it. And science, modern science has a lot of baggage like that. So that's an issue with science. Another issue with science is that in South Africa, the transformation of the scientific community is slow, right? So we are looking, at 20 plus years of democracy now. And while in the past, a low number of candidates for scientific positions or scientific studies of non-white groups may have been a problem, it's not the case anymore. The square kilometer array, so I come from astrophysics, so I'll give you examples in astrophysics. The square kilometer array project in South Africa, which is an incredible success story, has had a human capacity development program since the beginning that has given out over 1,200 bursaries since the beginning of the SKA project to South African learners. And so there are technicians, engineers, IT people, physicists, astronomers who have benefited from those bursaries and are there to be able to transform the scientific community. Or the National Astrophysics and Space Science Program, NASP, has been running since 2003 and has been offering bursaries in astrophysics and space sciences ever since. So having a low number of graduates, from backgrounds and black colored and whatever, is not an excuse anymore. It's absolutely not an excuse to not transformed the scientific community in South Africa. But then there's also the culture in the scientific community, the work culture. Because it's dominated by white Western people, it's also dominated by a white Western-centric approach. And often people from sort of minorities, not in South Africa, but minorities in the scientific community, have to adopt sort of dual identities. There's the identity of who they are at work, and there's the identity of who they are at home. And that is just one among so many different sort of cognitive barriers, you know, like context switching and this and that and language and so on, that makes science less accessible and less approachable and less transformable, if you will. And so there are issues with science as well. But then there's also issues with maths and science teaching. We've touched upon that at the beginning, but if we look at the context, from grade 4 onwards, maths and science is taught in English and Afrikaans, right? Below that, it's taught in the mother tongue. But grade 4 is age 8, turning on 9. You know, these are really, really young kids. And from there on, from that age, you have to learn maths and science in a language that may not be your first. So this represents a very unfair disadvantage for the vast majority of Black kids in South Africa. It's really, so the census data, again, it's those numbers. It's really quite a big barrier. Then there's the debate of pure mathematics versus maths lit. And so this is something where in grade 9, at age 15, learners have to choose. They have to choose maths, pure mathematics or maths lit. And math lits, if you look at the documentation and so on, it appears to be much more meaningful than pure mathematics because it includes things like budgeting, interest rate calculations and so on, things that are like practical for everyday life. So it's a very appealing choice. And pure mathematics has things like calculus and, you know, and trigonometry and so on, that doesn't really relate to everyday life. But when the kids are 15 and they in grade 9 and they have to choose, they're not told that if they don't take mathematics, they suddenly cut themselves off from the careers in science and technology, accounting, medicine, engineering, IT careers like software development and so on, chemistry, physics, astronomy and so on. Those careers require a pure mathematics at matric level to be able to study them at university. So again, our children at age 15 are asked to make a choice for their whole career when they don't even have all the information. They may not know what career possibilities may lay ahead. So it's an issue. And then, as been mentioned earlier, South Africa is amongst the worst in the world at teaching maths and science. It sounds very harsh, but sadly, it is shown over and over. So South Africa performs really poorly in international benchmarking programs like TIMSS. So just quickly, TIMSS is an international study. It's an assessment of the maths and science knowledge of 4th and 8th grade learners around the world. Now, South Africa, it's the grade 5 and grade 9 learners who take part in TIMSS. So there should be a 1-year advantage. Yes, yet if we look at the results, so 2019 was the last time TIMSS was run. It's every 4 years. And if we look at this figure here, if we look at just at the lowest benchmark, right? In mathematics, to show some basic mathematical knowledge for grade 5, and in science, to show some knowledge of physical and earth sciences, right? Only 37% of learners, or 28 in the case of science, managed to reach the low benchmark. That means that about 60% of learners in grade 5 aren't even able to reach the low benchmark. It's a very, very difficult situation. In grade 9, it's not much better. Again, if we look at the low benchmark for mathematics, 41% of learners reach the low benchmark, and only 36% of learners reach the low benchmark in science. So this is a really big challenge in our teaching of mathematics and science. Now, if we look at sort of official documents that say, oh, what can we learn from this TIMSS study? How can we approach it? We see a whole range of topics that I've shown here. This is TIMSSA.org, it's an official publication and so on. And they mention a lot of things. They even go and look at whether the schools are fee status, fee paying and no fee paying schools and so on. But there's no mention of language. And so in this picture, I think, we really need to think, excuse me, about language in our teaching of maths and science, in a way of building up the maths and science community in South Africa. And so now I'm going to tell you my journey from astrophysics coming into this and our collaboration. So when I first started looking at this, my portfolio is development and outreach. So I was looking at what information is there about astronomy careers in South Africa. And there is one resource, this black and white leaflet. It's been put together. It was put together, I think, in 2003 first. The latest version is from 2009. So I figured, okay, let's update this thing. And I started reading it, and I saw this thing that says characteristics of an astronomer. And the first one says a serious interest and above average aptitude for physics and mathematics. And to me, that will put learners off from embarking on an astronomy career because of language, because of the difficulty in teaching maths and science and so on. A lot of learners sadly feel like it's their shortcoming that they don't have the aptitude in maths and science, as opposed to maybe the way they were introduced to math and science and taught maths and science, but they're definitely bright enough. So I took notice of that message and thought, no, this is not a good message to have. But I also see point 5 is good communication skills. And at the heart of good communication skills is language. So we figured, let's start and try to design a new resource just about astronomy careers. And we wanted it to be featuring real people. So we've got real astronomers here who describe their experience of being an astronomer. So for example, Palesa here, she says that, it gives you travel the world, you meet people from all over the world, different cultures. Shaka here says that you can have lots of different careers if you study astronomer. You can be a data scientist, you can be a teacher, you can be a software engineer. It prepares you for the 4th Industrial Revolution. We have Sinan Nhlanhla here who talks about, you need to like problem solving and so on. And all of those things are just genuinely coming out of the great young astronomers that we have in this country. So we also wanted to have a bit of an attractive design. So we made it look a bit cartoony. We wanted to showcase the whole of South Africa. So we made a map where we have, every telescope, every radio telescope, every planetarium, university telescope, and so on, so that people feel like they can study astronomy all over the country, right? And just note here the legend, how short it is. Optical observatory, planetarium, university telescope, and radio observatory. We'll come back to that. And the last thing we wanted it to be is it should be available in all languages. And that's where obviously I hit a bit of a snag. I was like, okay, how am I going to do this, right? So I figured a careers information leaflet shouldn't have too much technical language. It should be easy to translate, right? Yes, well, I was very naive, as people who have worked in languages and education will testify. But I thought, let us have a social media call and see if people can volunteer translations. And we got great feedback. We got Afrikaans, Tswana, we got Spanish, we got Romanian, but there was no quality control. So we got Setswana. I asked another colleague of mine who speaks Setswana if it made sense. And the person was like, yeah, it needs a bit of work and so on. So I figured, maybe we should work a little bit on this before publishing it. And so this is when our collaboration started. And this is such an amazing collaboration. So Dr. Honji Konana, she's an education specialist in the Faculty of Science at UWC. She introduced me to Dr. Mokapela, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of African Language Studies at UWC. And we brought together two master's students, Shaka Mofokeng, who you've seen before. He is now working as a software developer at the observatory in Cape Town. He was a master's student in astrophysics. Mr. Sinathemba Nobom, he was a master's student in African language studies. He's now a language tutor and a researcher. They came together. Shaka speaks Sotho, Sinathemba speaks Xhosa, and together they discussed how to translate this simple career leaflet that we had designed and tried to create something that made sense. So Shaka was very kind, and he first translated it into Sesotho because that's his mother tongue, and he's a professional astronomer, so he knows the science, he knows how to describe it. And let me just show you. Remember, I showed you the map of South Africa, and with the legend, we had radio telescope, optical observatory, planetarium, cloud computing, university telescope, and radio telescope. And this is what he translated it into. And you can see that where we have, say, 2 words in English, it takes a lot more in other languages. So one of the lessons we learned was that when there is no vocabulary in the indigenous language for a scientific term, we need to rely on the language's structure. For example, the Nguni languages are very descriptive, you know, and if we try to impose a word for a meaning, which is a very sort of Western dictionary approach, we may not achieve the communication and the transmission of concepts and so on. I'll come back to that, but it was a very interesting lesson we learned. The second thing that we learned, also related to indigenous vocabulary, is that when there is no vocabulary in the indigenous language for a scientific term, we also need to rely on the language's common use to develop that vocabulary. And a great example is that, how do you say astronomer in African languages? And there is no word for astronomer, but there is a word that everybody knows that is in common usage because it's on the TV every day, is weather forecaster. And so if you stretch the meaning of the word for weather forecaster to mean a scientist of the sky, that can be an astronomer. It's really great. So we can rely on the language's common usage to stretch the meaning of things that people, just stretch the conceptual meaning and add a meaning to something that's already in use. And for example, radio astronomy is also something where, the term for radio means something we listen to. This is something that an issue we also have in English. But people listen a lot to the radio, and the radio DJs are constantly talking about the frequency of the radio stations. So using the term for frequency, talking about radio frequency astronomy, is much clearer than saying just radio astronomy, which is what we say, for example, in English. So we really need to rely on the language's own structures and own common usage of languages. Another lesson learned is that English words that already have a meaning can be misleading. So for example, when an English word is already in common use, but with a different meaning than the meaning used in science, we can confuse people by saying that. As an example, I use the word data or data. This is something that for most people in South Africa means it's something that you buy to access the internet on your cell phone. But for scientists, data is a form of information that hasn't just turned into knowledge yet because it needs to be analyzed. So instead of using the word, the English word data to mean data, we use the indigenous word for information that exists to describe the same concept. So we really need to be aware of the confusing potential of co-opting English terms without being aware of how they're used already. Another lesson learned is that English words have baggage, or they have historic but erroneous etymology. So let me explain what this means. The first thing, English words have baggage, right? So when English scientific words carries a colonial heritage, there can be a discomfort in being forced to use it, and we need to acknowledge that. The second part of this is that when an English scientific word originates from a historical, linguistically meaningful emergence of the word, but that's actually scientifically wrong. I'll give you an example. It's the best example, best used, described with an example. So for example, the word astronomer that we use in all Western languages comes from, well, in English, it comes from Middle English, that comes from Old French, astronomie, that comes from Latin, astronomia, that comes from Greek, from astronomos, that means star arranging. So clearly, this is something that we've inherited, but we know that stars are way too far and we can't go and arrange stars. That's not what astronomers do. So in terms of linguistics, the word is meaningful because it describes the history of how the field emerged, right? But scientifically, it's erroneous, it's wrong. We are not arrangers of stars. We are observers of the universe, right? We're scientists of the sky. And now we come back to this concept that it would be much more correct in the indigenous language, stretching from weather forecaster to say scientist of the sky, as opposed to saying astronomer or astronomo or astronomy or whatever, that, co-opting the English word. So it's really, really important that we are aware not just of the richness of the indigenous language, but also of the limitations of the English language. Another thing is the key role of indigenous knowledge. A lot of indigenous knowledge about the natural world is there in language, embedded in language, in lore, and similarly, in the origin of words. Like I just explained the origin of word astronomer in English, words in all languages have origins and they carry knowledge, right? So the thing is, indigenous knowledge is also often cited as, as anecdotal or interesting cultural curiosity, but it's often not put, in a place where it belongs in modern science, and it's not used to address modern science. It's changing now, especially in areas that have to do with like plant sciences and things and pharmacology and so on. But in astronomy, that's not really the case. Yet, indigenous knowledge, indigenous language and knowledge is critical to feeling ownership of the subject matter as opposed to the foreignness. I mentioned earlier that English is really a foreign language for most learners in the country, but also if you talk about a scientist and you only use, say, English words to describe that, a scientist, it takes a step more for a learner to identify with that profession if that profession is only ever represented by foreign people than by South African people, or of the same culture and language base as the learner himself or herself. So it's really, indigenous knowledge and language is key to really infiltrating and making science, which, if we consider science as knowledge that isn't dependent on language, we need to use language to penetrate that knowledge and to be able to teach it. So, well, I'll give you an example for that. Many of you will know the constellation of the Pleiades. We see it, it's a beautiful group of stars that we see in the sky. And so in Xhosa, it's called Isilemela. It's beautiful. And there's stories here that so many pastoralist groups of Southern Africa, it means the starting of the planting season. The Bushmen called it a summer's thing. In Kiswahili, it's East Africa. They're calling the plowing star or the digging stars, but also have to do with the planting season and so on. That is knowledge that is carried in the name of this constellation. If you look at the Western background of the Pleiades, well, in Greek mythologies, the Pleiades were the 7 daughters of Titan Atlas, who is this god who's holding up the world. And to save the 7 sisters from being raped by the hunter Orion, Zeus transformed them into stars. And, so this is pure lore. This doesn't carry any scientific knowledge in it. So if we look at what are the Pleiades, they are an open cluster. And it's a type of star cluster where all the stars have formed from the same cloud of gas, and they're sort of loosely bound by gravity, but it's a young group of stars, right? And so we call it, in English, we call it open cluster. We have this explanation for it. But open and cluster are a choice of words in English. Why can't we just call every open cluster Isilemela when we talk about astronomy in indigenous languages? And then the reference is to something that we know. Isilemela, I know it, I've seen it, it's in the sky, it means that, And so then you can understand when you study open clusters in other galaxies or whatever, you can say, an open cluster, I know what it is. It's like Isilemela. And it's so important to be able to connect on a very profound level that only mother tongue provides. So this will be my example. So another lesson learned is the adoption and the legitimacy when we try to develop or build a scientific language, right? So firstly, any new scientific resource needs to be tested in communities, right? And research shows that introducing new scientific language in schools, so schools is the best place to introduce new ideas and scientific languages and so on, for it to be adopted by communities around the school. It starts with the parents, but the parents have roles to play in the communities and in the families. So then it spreads through families and through society, and that's how it gets adopted. But also, if it doesn't take at school, maybe we need to rethink the language that we've developed. It really needs to be back and forth like that. So with our resource, sadly in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic halted our project to test our resources in the Eastern Cape schools, but we're hoping that this year we can start that again. So we have a collaboration with the Eastern Cape Education Department for that. So one more lesson, and this is the last lesson then I'm just touch upon thing, and then I'll be done. So language is really a thinking framework. It's more than just a set of words. Language shapes our thinking. I've mentioned this earlier before by saying the Western-centric thinking is very classification and nomenclature, and we put things in boxes and so on and so on. But if we speak more languages, it gives us more ways to think, right? So I'll come back to that in a second. And this applies to scientific thinking and understanding and the development of scientific instinct, right? So an indigenous scientific language must be built on a linguistic instinct. And that's the example that I showed you with Isilemela, an open cluster. If every open cluster in the universe is called Isilemela in Isixhosa, then that's the word for open cluster. And it's got instinct. It's got this, you don't have to consciously think that it's something you know, but you know what it looks like. And it looks open and it looks young and it has blue stars and so on. So it's very, it stimulates scientific instinct through linguistic instinct. And an example in English is any word that starts with mega something conveys something big, something large. But that's because we know mega means millions in Greek and we've adopted in our language. So that's kind of instinct that having a proper indigenous language provides on top of, just the understanding of the subject matter. And we cannot blindly apply Western frameworks like dictionaries, classifications, and so on to indigenous languages. For example, there are languages where you have terms for singular and plural, but not for specific numbers. And so that's a new concept to try to understand. There are other languages where the word you use to call something is defined by your relationship with it. So for example, I'll give you an example, Japanese, for example, you can't say a woman or a lady, or it depends on, if you talk about someone, your relationship to that person dictates how you call them. So if it's your boss, or if it's your aunt, or if it's your daughter, or whatever, use different words, right? And certain languages may not have a single word to encompass all of those relationships, right? So we have to be open to different ways of thinking that come with different languages. And so I've come from science and I've discovered this great thing called mother tongue-based multilingual education. It's really very well developed. It's developed by education specialists and by language specialists. It's very advanced in Asia, for example. So mother tongue-based multilingual education is an education that begins in the language that the learner speaks most fluently and then gradually introduces other languages. So if you think of science in South Africa, for example, instead of switching from indigenous language to, or mother tongue, to English or Afrikaans at grade 4, this seems, and there's a lot of research behind it, that seems to show that a gradual introduction would be much better, so that when you reach grade 12, you are equally fluent in maths and science in your mother tongue and in English, for example, which then enables you to go and study at university. So it's really a really quite interesting approach. And so this is what mother tongue-based multilingual education brings, for example. So this comes from a Unesco document, it's been studied inside and out and so on. But if you look at these attributes, there's nothing there that's really typical for science, right? So again, the science seems to be living somewhere else. So if you look at this for science, what do we get? We see that this type of mother tongue-based multilingual education improves language acquisition. It improves science learning because it improves sense making. You're able to make sense of what you're being taught means you're able to understand it, to conceptualize and so on. And that is another, this is being able to do that in your mother tongue removes cognitive barriers of language. Also community awareness, as I've mentioned, when scientific ideas are taught in the mother tongue, they spread more easily through communities and become part of general knowledge. And there's a transition to internationalism, as I was saying, then you can, when you come to the level of studying at university and going further, you are fluent in the international lingua franca of science that is currently English. And finally, it's also very, very good for creativity. Multilingual children are more creative and more able to, not just more creative, but more able to use their creativity in learning. And that applies to science and math learning as well. So this is the incredible body of input and learnings and lessons learned and things that we've learned along this project. And I just want to, come and see this sort of up and down path that we all follow somehow, personally in our life journeys, but also in our learning journeys. Firstly, we have a lot to do to improve the accessibility of maths and science in South Africa. But then we know that learning in one's mother tongue now is key to improving learning. And then we also know that science is only part of the content. The science, like the ideas and fact, but it's small, but all the linguistic construction and the construction of teaching materials and training and how we convey it is really, really important. And then language is a living thing. It's something where, you know, it evolves and terms get adopted and terms gain more meaning in different contexts and so on. And we need to be attuned to that evolution and maybe nudge it, but also take advantage of it. And then translate, test, adapt constantly. This needs to be an ongoing conversation. And then I'd like to finish on this note that if we get this right, just imagine all of us South African learners being fully comfortable in maths and science, just for the maths and science and not with language barriers. Just imagine what this could achieve for tomorrow's generation. And with that, I thank you very much and open the floor to questions. Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing. Absolutely amazing. Thank you very much, Dr. Ödman. Right, we have some questions, and I think we need to actually just get through and internalize some of the amazing stuff that you've done, and how much further we've got to go in this journey of science education in mother tongue. So there are some questions posted. I'm gonna give you the opportunity to answer the one by Paul Lebrick at the moment. Can you see the question?
Let me see.
Q&A.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, right, yes. Indigenous language and knowledge is critical to feeling ownership of the subject matter as opposed to foreignness. Are the consequences of this thought to be at the individual language level or at the cross-language level? Right. I think, so the Pleiades and open cluster, I think open cluster as a term has emerged in English, but also in other European languages similarly. So in French, for example, it's amas ouvert, which is literal translation of open cluster. Foreignness refers to the associating English with people that one doesn't identify with. That's what I mean by that. So if science is only expressed in a language that a learner doesn't identify with, it's very difficult to identify with the subject matter. So I hope that clarifies the answer. And Paul, very nice to see you again after many years.
Thank you very much. We then have a live question. A hand is up. And I have some other questions that came through Facebook. So can we ask Leratadi Liu, if you could ask Dr. Ödman your question, please.
Hi, everyone. And hi, Carolina. Thanks for a nice talk. So I have a question that has two parts to it. One about language and translation, and the other part is about, I guess, teaching languages teaching science in native language. And so the first part about translation and linguistic, I guess, is just to say, I mean, you went through some lessons learned from the project, and it looks like a lot of these lessons learned are based on just what is happening in the project, either personal experiences and so forth. What they are not doing is using lessons learned from literature and the scientific community of translators and the scientific community of linguistics. Because basically, when you use lessons learned from such literature, you will find that a lot of the lessons learned mentioned here are well documented there and are in fact not new. Things like that you need to translate concept versus words and so forth. So as you appreciate, it's like in astronomy, right? If somebody was just trying to understand what they are learning based on their personal experience, they are not going to make a lot of mileage. So I guess it's just to be aware of that it might be useful to also relate to, to the scientific knowledge in translation and in linguistic. And a lot of that is actually, a lot of it has happened here in South Africa itself. And then my other question is about teaching science in native languages and whether its benefits. And I think it's well documented that multilingualism in education is really good at primary school level. There's a well-documented United Nations study about this, and that's why people are pushing that. At the high school and higher levels, it's not so well established that this is the way to go. And I think you sort of hinted at it when you mentioned your background earlier on, in these different countries, moving and so forth. So it's not really clear that at that level, Indigenous language actually is better, because it's actually concepts that people are having much more a harder time with, concepts of the science, or even concepts of, of practice in that language. So I think it's a bit of a romanticization to just assume, to think that it's the way to go at these higher levels. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Leo, for these comments. Very, very relevant comments indeed. The lessons learned, were really from, yes, indeed, from our project. But we got, substantial input. The collaboration is with the Department of African Language Studies at UWC, and their input. So I was sort of telling that from the sort of scientist learning from the linguists' perspective, because I think there's a lack of awareness among scientists who have gone through the motions and are fluent in English now, like myself, coming from French or whatever, in how how rich the linguistics actually is and how important it is beyond the scientific concepts. And so yes, they are based on this project, and I really want to communicate that languages is much more complex than just translating single words into a dictionary. That would sort of be the naive approach from a scientist saying, oh, we don't have science in that language, let's just translate those terms. But that it comes with much more baggage, it comes with thinking frameworks, it comes with all of that. And yes, those have been very well studied, absolutely. And you've mentioned the UN mother tongue-based multilingual education. And this is also, I refer to it as a really vast body of knowledge. And when you say that the benefits of multilingual education aren't necessarily clear at high level, I think it is made clear in the context of international education. So for example, international schools in different countries have a very big attraction, and they do multilingual education up till matric level or equivalent, international baccalaureate and so on, and such programs. So there is evidence of its benefits, but obviously the learners who go to international schools tend to come from very privileged backgrounds and international parents and so on. So the internationalism of their upbringing may also play a role, and it's impossible to assign credit to one or the other, just purely multilingual education or a general international exposure. However, I do think that, well, you've mentioned it's the concept that needs to be translated. When I came to the UK and suddenly everything was in English, I had to stop and pause when I was reading and think, what concept that I know in French does this term relate to? And that sort of increased, if anything, just my reading time by 400% at the beginning, So so like it is a cognitive barrier that, you know, that we need to tackle. But I also think when you say that teaching science in mother tongue at high levels is not necessarily well known, I also think that people who are researching education and people who are researching language and instruction may not have focused on science at higher levels very much, because I think science at high level also has a bad reputation of being a difficult subject and something that you can study only if you're a scientist of that subject and so on. So I think there's also sort of a bit of a lack of focus on teaching science at high levels from the education linguistics perspective. But as you mentioned, it's very well studied at primary level. Yes, indeed, absolutely. I hope this helps clarify a bit.
I'm sure it certainly does. Just a reminder, colleagues, when you ask your question, if you can please phrase your question in 30 seconds. Dr. Ödman has got many questions to answer, comments to look at, and we don't have much time for that. So Dr. Ödman, can I read you the next question from Facebook?
Yes.
Right. So we have a question from Susan Webb, is how to engage in effective outreach visits beyond the career-focused engagements we usually have. Go ahead and answer that.
Okay. Oh, this is a completely different subject, and thank you for that question. It's a very, very important one. One of the big topics and one of the reasons why we need to transform the scientific community in South Africa is representation and role models. If we have a minority of South African scientists in the scientific community, they bear the burden of being the face of that science for all of the country. Whereas if we have many of them, that burden of being a role model and being representative, saying, hello, I'm from the Eastern Cape and I'm a scientist, or, you know, I'm from the Northwest and I'm a scientist, and having people who are as diverse as the country, who can all be role models, will you know, we can't, like, look at the diversity of South Africa. We can't just have one Black astronomer who can be the role model for all Black learners in South Africa. It's not possible. It makes no sense. We really need to build up role models, young astronomers, showcase them, show how they're, you know, how great they're doing, how incredibly smart they are, and value when they go into outreach, because they do, and they go and tell their stories and how they got to where they are and so on. But that is not necessarily valued in a, say, a research-focused career. And so it's getting there. Thankfully, things are changing, but we really need to value the incredible work of outreach, representation, and role modeling that our African scientists are doing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ödman. We have a question from Paul Lebrecht. Paul, please go ahead.
Okay, here we are. I wanted to react about the fact that translators' knowledge is well spread, and there's a lot of literature. One thing that Carolina showed us, which was really, I think, critical, is that the transfer between languages is important to get a career. It's important because the students really you know, will want to progress into the career, into for example, the scientific literature, or for example, you know, talking to people into outside the country. And as far as I could find into the multilingual literature that concerns mathematical teaching, I can say that, you know, explicitly formulating wishes, requirements, features that help about a translation process, about a switching, having the same content in several languages and using both languages at the same time. I don't think this is something which is well studied yet. But I mean, this UNESCO project is maybe a different thing, and maybe you are going to bring examples here. Are there pupils that would come with both languages in their report and saying, you know, this is good, I saw both languages?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It raises a very good point, is the use of more than one language in the classroom itself. So there is some work, notably in South Africa, So, for example, there's a postdoctoral research fellow, a Saatchi Chair research fellow in the School of African Languages at Rhodes University, Michael Kretzer, who studies this, and he's been studying, for example, in how in classrooms in Limpopo they use code mixing and language switching in the classroom to teach. Where again, it's at primary level, but they use more than one language in the classroom, and there's some really interesting work going on about that. So it's a really good point having a multilingual classroom itself, a multilingual space, because it benefits majority speakers of one language as much as majority speakers of another language. Very much so. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Thanks for that response. Thank you, Paul, for the question. I have a question from Itateng Makoro. What are the practical challenges that the project encountered in the Eastern Cape? Was there any pushback? If so, who was more resistant, learners or teachers? Oh, this is a good one.
Thank you for that question. I'm afraid the answer is very simple. It was COVID. Because we developed the resources in 2019, and in 2020 we were going to go to the schools, and 2020 COVID happened, the schools closed, and then there was part-time schooling, and the challenges for the schools were just, innumerable. So for us to come and say, oh, can we test this thing? It would have been an imposition, really. Dr. Mokapela, my colleague from the African Language Studies Department at UWC, she has very good contacts in the Eastern Cape Education Department. And so thankfully, we haven't seen any pushback. But COVID really froze that. It's very sad to say, it's frozen many things.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks. No, that's very, very practical. Thanks for that. Freddie Mashate would like to answer the next question, which Freddie, can you read out the question and your response, please?
Apologies, Paddy. That was a technical mistake. You may proceed.
Okay, thank you. Right, here's your next question from Lisa. I translated Lucy and Stephen Hawking's book titled George's Secret Key to the Universe. It is all about the solar system, the planets, the comets, the meteors, spaceships, etc. We make these materials in African languages, but we need to do an audit of what is available in African languages and find ways to get these used in schools. However, the insistence on English by education officials make it difficult for teachers to use these resources. What's your comment? What's your response?
Yeah, no, it's a very, very good comment. We know that teachers have to, obey the directives of education departments and the SAPS curriculum and so on. It's a very formalized system to be able to, I guess it's attempting to sort of provide some uniformity across the country. So when we come with something that's different, teachers, we rely on teachers' goodwill, if you will, to be able to make room in their very packed workload for this sort of introduction of different materials and so on. But if we can, then there is, and we do it properly, then we have evidence that we can then present, go back to the education department and to the policymakers, who then can sort of evolve the policies. But it's a very difficult and very hard process. And I think, South Africa is not the only one, everywhere in the world, taking research in education and leading to practical changes in the way teaching is done at school is a very slow and arduous process. But thank you for that comment. It's a very important one.
Okay, thanks for the response. I have a question from Chris McCartney. He's in agreement with the home language teaching in SA. And his question is, let's see. Well, his comment, he prefixes his question to say that SA parents from different language groups choose to send the children to so-called X-Model C or Quintile 4 and 5 or private schools, traditionally English or Afrikaans. Not only because they see these schools as providing their children with a better education, but also to improve their English. And that comes back to the point you made about business, the language of business and so on is English. And let's see, Chris's final question is, how do you see these schools being able to teach learners in multiple different languages? Is this practical?
Okay, so it's a very, very interesting question. This topic is so big, we could go on forever. So there's, for example, if you look at immigrant populations, you know, to say Western countries, and you take second generation children from immigrant families, they often don't speak the language of their grandparents, because the parents would have moved to that country and would want, you know, for a better life, want better opportunities, better career prospects for their children and so on. And so they insist on them learning the language of the country, typically English or whatever, right? And this I can tell you that for even my own children, who I grew up speaking Swedish, but then I learned everything in French. I'm sending my kids to the French school because I like the French curriculum in maths and science, and they live in an English-speaking world. So I think this is, my kids don't speak a word of Swedish, and it's completely lost on them. And I've spoken to many friends who themselves are sort of second generation from migrating families and have lost that linguistic connection with, say, their grandparents. And so it's a loss. It is a loss, but it's also the fruit of the pressures of the time, and you know that you want to go for a better economic future, you go and you do what you must to get that, and so on. Even, okay, my own kids as well, on their dad's side, their grandparents speak Tamil, but my kids don't speak a word of Tamil either, right? So so they have English and French, and so we lose these languages, but hopefully we can keep sort of a cultural continuity and things. It really is driven by economic growth and opportunities and so on. But things will change. You know, we have more and more schools in South Africa that teach a Mandarin, right, or Cantonese, because of the rise of China. And if, I don't know, if in 10 years' time Chinese becomes a lingua franca, I will be completely obsolete because I speak English very well now. I've gone through that, but Chinese, I don't speak a word. So and am I doing a disservice to my children by not teaching them Chinese? I don't know. You know, it changes very fast in terms of generations at the same time as changes are being slow. Language is a living thing. There's no answer.
Sure, thanks. We have a question, actually, volunteering services from Khanati Shaku. Good presentation, Dr. Ödman. How can one form part or make contribution to this great initiative?
Oh, wow, thank you. Please contact me by email, because we're building this interest also from Africans in the diaspora, say in North America and so on, who start having this conversation, but also in our sister African countries. You know, in Kenya there's a lot of interest. You know, in Tanzania and Kiswahili speaking countries, that region, and also in West Africa when it comes to the role of French and so on. So there's a lot of interest. Like, this is really seems to be coming of age now. You know, people are getting more and more interested. In fact, there is the fact that technology is more multilingual friendly as well is important. So there's a fantastic initiative called Matakane that's led by Konsivan Marivate at the University of Pretoria, where they develop machine learning translations into African languages. But to be able to train those machine learning algorithms, you need data. You need to have actual translations to feed that machine learning algorithm. And this is also, so this is something that's growing as well. So, you know, I think there's a growing community. Please send me an email and I'll be more than happy to, you know, involve you or connect you with other people doing similar work, or whatever your area of interest is. I think, you know, get in touch.
Thank you. And your email has just been posted on the chat. So anyone else that would like to contribute, please feel free to reach out. The next question is from Richard Weideman. Have you worked at all with the Wikimedia South Africa community for translations? They organize regular group effort drives to work together on content relevant to South Africa.
Thank you. It's a really good comment. I have not engaged with Wikimedia South Africa. I will definitely make a note of that, because those drives really tend to make strides. You know, they create a lot of content, and then that content is tested and adopted and so on, and then there's another drive, and so it really pushes things forward in a really good way. For the science and physics teachers in the audience will be familiar with the PhET simulations, which the University of Colorado has been developing for years now. Those are online simulations that show physics experiments. So you can interact with them. You can learn. So if you don't have a lab at school, for example, you can use those simulations to interact with physical experiments. And they have a really great set of simulations, a lot of evidence that supports their work, and so on and so on. Well, now they also have a drive for translators into African languages. And isiZulu is one of the languages that they prioritize. And they're currently pushing for a drive of translators and people to join that community. So this is really physics oriented and at teaching level. But there's actually an information session on the 16th of February. So if you would like information about that, please send me an email, and I'll be very happy to send you how to register for that information session on how to translate the PhET simulations. But I will reach out to the Wikimedia translation people as well. That's a good input. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Right, here's something I've picked up in your presentation. You mentioned that the scientific words that are historical, they were actually developed according to historical formulations. You know, they were derivatives from specific languages. So that's how new words were developed. And you also stated that language is a living thing. Now, what is preventing new terminologies in African languages from starting to be formulated?
That's a very good point. So there is an incredible science journalist in South Africa, right? Let me just close this. He is working on translating, on writing scientific languages in isiZulu, and he's really quite amazing. His name is Sibusiso Biela. What he's done is he was asked to write an article about paleontology in isiZulu, and realized that there were no words for, say, dinosaur and things like that. And he was looking at the origin of the word dinosaur, which we know what it means, we know what it symbolizes, we have a concept of these big animals that don't exist anymore, and so on. And etymologically, so in the sense of where the word comes from, it means old lizard. But we know that they're not lizards. They were not lizards or reptiles. It's a different group of animals. So when he developed a word to mean dinosaur in isiZulu, he developed it to be more accurate than the word in English by establishing it with the, in line with the knowledge that we have today. So I think it's a version of ancient animal or something like that, but it's not restrictive to, say, lizard, because there were more than lizards. And I think this is really a great way to start building this and actualizing, if you're going to develop scientific language today, make sure that the words mean what they mean, right? And not co-opt historic things that may have baggage, that may be wrong nowadays, and so on and so on. So it's a really, Sibusiso Biela, please look up his work. It's absolutely fantastic. And he's also got a lot of things to say about language, African languages and science.
Sure, no, that's really great that we are formulating our own South African words for these things. I have a comment, a really touching comment, and I just thought I'll read it out and get your take on it. It's a comment from Ruby Zauka, and she's quoting the late Nelson Mandela. Mandela once said, "If you talk to a man in language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his own language, that goes to his heart." And to contextualize this, he was relating the story as to how he learned Afrikaans so that he could speak to his jailer in his own languages. And of course, there's a lot of history around that. But this is also really great for getting our learners to engage in science. If the words, that's spoken in their languages, are understandable. And do you think it would probably increase the uptake of science? What's your comment on that?
Most definitely. Thank you for that beautiful quote. It's spot on. And you know, if we have science, if we have a way of talking about science in the mother tongues, in African languages, in indigenous languages, then the children who are passionate about it are able to talk about it to, say, their parents, their grandparents, their friends. They can share the passion. And it's really the language of the heart, right? And if you are able to share your passion, and you are able to share with your parents and your grandparents what you are going to study and the possible careers that you can have and so on, I think the buy-in and the support and the encouragement can be so much stronger. And I know that, you know, it's a bit of a sort of running image to say that, you know, parents want their kids to be doctors or lawyers or whatever, but I think if we have more language to talk about more careers and different ones, and engineering and science and so on, I think we'll have that also come up in the interest areas and in the career choices and the study choices of our learners, most definitely.
Thank you very much for that. Dr. Ödman, we are at the end of our session. What are your parting statements? If you were talking to the Minister of Education or the Minister of Science and Innovation, what is a message that they need to hear about what your research has shown us? And of course, where your project of translating is going.
I don't, it's a very difficult question. There's not a single thing to say, but I think conveying an openness and an open-mindedness, you know, to less rigid structures of instruction and structures of study that will enable, you know, creativity and innovation to emerge from our young students and young scientists as they come up, as they have diverse ways of thinking about things and stuff. I think that would be great. But obviously, if I speak to a minister, I say, you know, you need to put resources towards this.
Don't we all?
Yes.
Dr. Carolina Ödman, the Associate Director and an avid researcher, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really exciting. You've entered a field which some of us have never thought about because we are kind of just stuck by what we find in books in the language that we were colonized by. But thank you for also bringing that up on how these names have stuck. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank the audience for participating, posting your questions, your comments. There was a lot of engagement from many of you in the Q&A, and thank you for that. Not all of them were questions, but we have read your valuable comments, and thank you for joining us in another CIFES Africa presentation. Thank you, Dr. Carolina Ödman, and you are released to enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. I hope the weather is great down in the Western Cape. And to the rest of you, thanks for joining us. This is Pati Chetty signing off on behalf of CIFES Africa. Goodbye.